Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for those of you who've been waiting a little while. I'm very glad you've all been able to join us for what promises to be an extremely interesting discussion. I'm Chris Hodge. I'm Senior Advisor to the IoD Centre for Corporate Governance. We're jointly hosting this webinar with the University of Bristol School of Management, and Will Harvey, who you can see on the screen, is Professor of Leadership at the business at Bristol, and he will be moderating today's session. I'll hand over to Will shortly to introduce himself and the topic in a bit more detail. But first, I'd just like to introduce our three panelists, and we're extremely grateful to all of them for agreeing to share their experience and insight with us this afternoon. Taking them in alphabetical order rather than any other, we'll start with Lee Elliott Major. Lee is Britain's first Professor of Social Mobility and was appointed by the University of Exeter to be a global leader in this field. Lee was previously Chief Executive of the Sutton Trust, which is a charity dedicated to improving social mobility and addressing educational disadvantages, and also a trustee of the Education Endowment Foundation. And he works closely with educators, policymakers, and with the boards of companies to try and improve socioeconomic diversity. Next, Sir Peter Gershon, who has a long and distinguished business career, having previously been the chair of National Grid, Tate & Lyle, and a number of other well-known companies. He currently chairs the Infinium Group and the Dreadnought Alliance, and is a trustee of both the Sutton Trust and the Education Endowment Foundation, which is where he knows Lee. And in addition, he's also led a number of major public sector reviews. And last but most definitely not least, Emma Turnbull. Emma is Community Investment Manager at Allen Overy, where she's responsible for many of the firm's UK education and employment initiatives. And she has a particular interest in social mobility, both within Allen and Overy, but also with the local communities where they operate, and manages foundations who provide access to justice and access to education and employment in the UK. And in a similar role is a trustee of the London Legal Support Trust that raises funds for free legal advice services in London and the South East. I'm sure you're all keen to hear from our panel, so I'll hand over to Will now. Before doing so, just to let you know that you've all been automatically muted for now. So if while the panelists are speaking, you want to ask a question or comment, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Once we move into the open section of the discussion, I think Will may want to invite you to raise your hands using that icon and speak in person, but at least to start with, please use the Q&A. With that, as I said, welcome everybody, and Will, over to you and the panel.
Thank you very much, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Will Harvey, Professor of Leadership at the University of Bristol, International Research Fellow at the IoD Centre for Corporate Reputation. And from a governance perspective, I'm chair of the board of a large charity called Libraries Unlimited, which is based in the southwest of the UK. So obviously we're going to be talking about social mobility, which is the movement of people within and between social strata and society. And so I guess an overarching question really is why are we talking about this from a governance perspective? And I think there are three reasons principally that we need to understand. And I think first, there is a moral responsibility for business to support talented and diverse people who have visible and invisible differences. Secondly, I think it's really important for business in terms of signaling fairness. And thirdly, there's strategic benefits in terms of both attracting and retaining talent from diverse backgrounds to serve diverse stakeholder audiences. So the webinar today, we've got three, as you've already heard, fantastic experts from very different lenses. We've got a social mobility expert. We've got someone with senior business leadership experience and someone that's actually practicing social mobility within the workplace as well. So in the first half, I'm going to ask a series of questions to these experts, principally drawing upon sort of three themes. One are sort of, well, what are the problems? Why should we really care about this? So in other words, what do board members, why do board members really need to engage with social mobility? The second is really looking at tangible examples, because it's great to talk about these things in theory, but what's the actual practice in terms of examples that we can draw upon as best practice? And third, and I guess probably an area that everyone wants to know, what are some of the solutions? What are things that we can actually do and specifically what can boards do to up their game around social mobility. So without further ado, then let's get straight on with some questions. Lee, if you wouldn't mind me starting with you. As Chris said, the first professor of social mobility in the UK, obviously not wanting to patronize the audience here who probably know a little bit about social mobility, but perhaps you could just tell us a little bit broadly about what exactly is social mobility and why is it a pressing issue for business?
So as you said, Will, I think there's many definitions actually of social mobility. I like to think of it as the chances of getting on in life, actually defined in different ways. So and that could mean becoming a board member of a company. It could be becoming a teacher, but I suppose the sort of principle beneath this idea of social mobility is that your background shouldn't determine where you end up in life, whatever that may be. And what we know from many studies over the years is that social mobility is lower in the UK than it could or should be. And indeed, that for generations growing up now, so maybe those born around the millennium, we're observing lower absolute social mobility than previous generations. So you're less likely to do better than your parents if you're young in Britain. And that was even before the pandemic. And that's the first time we've had that situation since the war, certainly. So every generation did slightly better since the war. So we know that that's an issue for this generation growing up now. We also know that we have particularly sticky ends in the UK. So that means there's particular stickiness, if you like, at the top of society. So the same sorts of people getting those jobs, the very influential, powerful jobs. We also know there's a sticky end at the bottom as well, those leaving school without skills, without basic skills and qualifications, tending to come from similar families. There's always exceptions to those rules, but in general, we find that there's a persistence over generations in the end, at the ends of the sort of society. The other thing I would say, Will, just to sort of get us into this, I think, is that education, and Emma and Peter and I've worked together on this. We're all passionate about education, but I think the evidence would suggest that education is a necessary but not sufficient factor in improving social mobility. So you can do lots through education, but what the studies suggest is that even if you have a degree from the same university, the same subject, if you're from a less privileged background, you're still less likely to earn as much as your more privileged peer and progress in the workplace. So there's something, I think, particularly in the UK, that is an issue in the workplace that we need to tackle. The last point I'd say on this is that my worry, and we'll probably get into this, is that I think that while there has been some good progress in terms of diversity and inclusion in the workplace, I think we are only at the very beginning in terms of improving socioeconomic diversity in the talent that we attract. In many ways, I've called it the sort of missing dimension of diversity. And I think there's some great exceptions to that, but there's too few cases. And one study that I was involved in, we looked at the FTSE 100 companies, for example, and we found when we really dug deep into what they were actually doing, only about 12 of those companies could make claim to having social class or socioeconomic diversity as part of their mainstream diversity effort. So I'll stop there. There's lots more I could say, but that's a sort of a general picture that I would paint.
Thanks a lot, Lee. And I was going to pick up on the business part of my question. So maybe you could just sort of elaborate a little bit more, that you've said that there are just sort of 12 companies. So what specifically, we've got a business audience here who are specifically interested in governance issues. What's the role do you think that business can play in this then, if it's not predominantly about education providers to address this?
So I think there's some basic things, you can do. So just gathering the data, and this is something that I've spoken again to Peter and Emma over the years about. So really just literally getting socioeconomic background data on your workforce. In many ways, that is the first thing you should do to determine whether you have a problem and at what level in your company. We do that for other aspects. So for gender and ethnicity, we do gather data in that. And I think, you know, that has to be at board level and all the way through actually the organization. I think, you know, what's also good, I think, is to have some sort of mentoring program and some sort of networks. There's some really good examples of this, of staff themselves actually creating social mobility networks, and that might involve mentoring. It's really, to be honest, often having other people to talk to sharing anxieties and thinking, if you're from sort of different backgrounds, you know, finding people that you can relate to. There's a lot of interesting talk about imposter syndrome in the corporate workplace, and I think one of the ways that you can get around that is by talking to others actually about your background and sharing those anxieties. And that, I think there is some evidence that even just doing that can make it better for you in terms of where you're thinking about a progression in the workplace. I think if you want to really go up to a higher level, I would say, I think you have to look at the top of the organization, in my view. And I don't think we've done enough of this, is looking at, in my view, socioeconomic diversity on the boards themselves. I think that sends a very powerful signal throughout the organization. I also think that organizations need to look at how they look at talent. How do you select for talent? How do you promote people? A general statement, I would say, I think we don't define talent as accurately as we could do. So we tend to use proxies for talent, which tend to be tied up with being middle class. And we use those, and there's lots of examples of this, as ways of measuring talent in the workplace. I think we could be clearer about that. And then the last thing I would say, Will, is, and we've seen this recently, I do think we should consider targets. You know, this does polarize some discussions, but, you know, KPMG recently announced targets for having a certain proportion of middle managers from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens there, but I think other organizations could follow that lead. So those are some of the things I think that businesses could do.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lee. Lots more questions coming your way in due course. I think before we move on to Emma, just a reminder, if you do in the audience have any questions, please feel free to add them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, and we'll try and get to those in a few minutes' time. Emma, should we move on to sort of tangible examples of what's actually going on in business? And you're very much at the coalface of this in terms of actually practicing a lot of these things within Allen & Overy. Love to hear a little bit more from you in terms of some good initiatives that are hopefully starting to gain traction.
First of all, thank you very much for having me on the panel today. It's great to see so many people on the call. It's probably fair to say that there's lots of employers probably joining us that have been doing and been quite active in this space for well over sort of 20 years. I've certainly been partnering with local schools in the city, supporting underprivileged children for a number of years now. I remember even 10, 12 years ago, partnering with initiatives like the Sun Trust on pathways to law, and the legal sector collaborating when it came to setting up prime commitment to ensure that lots more young people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds received work experience. I think in the last 5 to 6 years, I think I've seen a noticeable sort of step up in terms of more active involvement in this space. Certainly for Allen & Overy, we set up our own internal social mobility working group, and that's made up of key individuals across parts of the business, including diversity, equity, inclusion, our graduate recruitment, early careers, and also where I sit in the pro bono and community investment team. So our social mobility now is actually a strategic priority for the firm alongside other areas of diversity, and I think that's really important. That only happened last year, and it was a real sort of game changer for us. And last year we also set up our social mobility action plan, and that is really to help sort of join up the firm's thinking, generate ideas, but then also track our progress in this area too. So our plan focuses on 4 areas, which probably are quite familiar to maybe how other businesses might be structuring this area of work. So we have Raising Aspirations, which includes everything that we do with young people and how that stems through to a recruitment pipeline. We also want to be open and accessible. So we want to ensure that we remain attractive, but then also that we're accessible to a wide mix of students that want to join Alan Overy. We're also really keen about promoting an inclusive environment as well, and that means fostering a greater understanding of the barriers that some of our people face. And then finally, around influencing the wider debate, so engaging with our clients and suppliers and also public policy. So 2 examples of what we've done. We have launched a new apprenticeship programme for school leavers, which leads them to a qualification as a UK solicitor. This is a 6-year apprenticeship programme. We'll have our first cohort of 6 apprentices join the firm in September. And then obviously, I think Lee might have been looking at my notes beforehand. So one of the things that I'm really proud about is that we're about to launch our own internal social mobility network here at the firm. And we really want to make sure that it's a place and a space for people to share experiences, to create that inclusive environment, and also celebrate that everyone does have different backgrounds. And also just to raise awareness about social mobility for people who are less familiar or don't have that lived experience as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Emma. And thank you for those that have already asked some very interesting questions, which we'll get to shortly. Emma, one question I had was around sort of buy-in within the organisation, which I think links to one of the anonymous attendee questions. At the outset, and I guess there are some attendees here who are really trying to get some traction, what kinds of things can you do to really get people to accept that this is something that is serious and we really need to engage with, as opposed to a fad that's going to pass?
So again, I'm going to pick up on what Lee mentioned. It's around collecting data. So I think if you start collecting data on your own workforce, I think presenting data is a very robust way of changing the conversation internally, and I think that certainly helped us as well. So I think my starting point for anyone on the call, if you're not already collecting data, you need to start looking at sort of what is the makeup of your own organisation, because you can come up with some great programs and some great initiatives, but actually what are your overall aims? What are you trying to do, and what are you trying to change within your own business? So if you don't know actually what the landscape looks like, I think that is a real key starting point for any organisation to look at.
Thank you. Lee, you alluded earlier to sort of the rhetoric versus the reality. Anything that you would add to that question about sort of getting momentum early on?
Yeah, I think it is about gathering data to begin with. I also think that the sort of people networks is really important, actually, because my sense is, and the studies do suggest, is that there are people that can feel quite isolated in organizations, partly because that this issue perhaps hasn't been recognized as much as other aspects of diversity. You know, in a recent FT article, you know, I was being provocative, but I was sort of saying for boards, you can have, you know, fewer white males on the board, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's any less posh, right? So, you know, if you're a white working class male, at the moment, many diversity drives will miss you. And so I do think it's important to recognize this as an issue, because my fear is that it will mean that people sort of you know, won't embrace actually other aspects of diversity. I see this as all, you know, all these things interrelate. So I think it's really important that this is surfaced at a high level, actually, because I think it can lead to resentment in part of the workforce if you don't recognise it. So I think data on the one hand, but allowing and even incentivising staff groups to sort of think about this properly is another.
Thanks, Lee. While we're on sort of data and measurement, I noticed that Patrick McDonald, the chair of the IoDs, has asked a question around how we can better define and measure socioeconomic diversity, particularly at senior levels within organisations. I don't know if you wanted to address that one before we move on to Peter.
Yeah, it's a great question. We could have a whole hour on this. I won't bore you with all the details. It's a great question, Patrick. I mean, the standard approach at the moment is to use socioeconomic background, to use occupations of parents, so that so the surveys that we use at the moment, and this is a more sociological sociologist sort of approach rather than economists who would just look at income of backgrounds. And what basically you do is you ask what the mother and father did when you were younger. Usually it's age 14, 16, it can vary a little bit. And then those occupations then are classified in an official way, into different socioeconomic groupings. And you can do that fairly easily. I mean, one of my worries, though, with some of the reporting at the moment is that it's reported in three very broad groupings. So it's high, middle, and lower socioeconomic class, essentially. One of the issues with that, it doesn't give you the accuracy, perhaps, that you might want. So in that top group, for example, the highest socioeconomic group, we're talking about 40% of the population. So I personally, if we could have if I had my way, I think we would probably publish the 7 class grouping, so you would know who was in the very top, who was in the bit below. So you can do that using that sort of data. I think the problem with all this is balancing the people like me saying, "Oh, you need all this," against the pragmatism of being able to do this and not being too burdensome in staff surveys. But the other things that the government and others have recommended is, for example, surveying whether people went to state or private school, whether they received free school meals when they were a pupil. But I suppose the main one that people use is the occupation of your mother and father when you were younger. One final point on that, Will, I think it's really good if organisations, and the civil service has done this actually, in one of the biggest surveys in this area ever done, about 100,000 people, they also asked people to self-define their class. And that was very interesting because often that's slightly different to the actual class background defined by your mum and dad's occupation. And there's lots of discussion about what is class. Is it what you are as an adult? Is it what you are when you were younger? But I think it's quite important to allow people room to say what they think they are as well. But you would probably use that initial thing, the occupations data, for monitoring data in the organisation. But that's kind of best practice at the moment.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lee. And presumably there are temporal and geographical aspects to class. I can see Caroline's asked a question, which we'll get to, around the international component of class as well. So let's come to that shortly. Peter, if it's okay, let's move to you. Obviously, boards have one or two things on their plates at the moment strategically. So why would social mobility come under their kind of top list of priorities, do you think?
So I think there are two reasons, Will. One is there is a talent shortage in this country. There is competition amongst employers for talented people at all sorts of levels. And if either through implicit or explicit barriers, we as potential employers are excluding people from consideration because of socioeconomic factors, rather than focusing in on their true talent and ability, we are limiting the pool in which we are able to either promote from within or recruit new talent into businesses. So I think there is that very specific issue about making sure that the talent pool is as wide as possible and is not being artificially constrained. The second issue is a wider one, which is, I think there is a continuation of quite a long-term trend now about both governments and wider society expecting organisations to be representative of the society they seek to serve. And that manifests itself in different ways. I mean, we've seen that through gender diversity and now the pressure on ethnic diversity in boardrooms, and social mobility is sort of is gathering momentum as an agenda. The government is supporting it in different ways. An increasing number of employees are taking steps around social mobility, and I think it is only a matter of time before shareholders through the ESG lens will look increasingly at what companies are doing in this space. And I think it is certainly conceivable that we will see some form of social mobility reporting introduced by the government in due course, similar to what we've seen with gender and ethnic pay type reporting. I think it is coming.
In the early days of gender and ethnic diversity quotas and that agenda, there was a degree of sort of cynicism, people saying, well, you know, we don't want tokenistic types of gestures. How do we get through that much quicker in the context of social mobility so people take it seriously from the outset?
Well, I think in some ways, gender pay reporting, you know, has enabled people to focus more systemically on the issue than whether boards have, you know, whether they have 30% of the board is female. I mean, that to some extent is, you know, it's an important optic, but in some ways having to explain to publicly why there are significant differences in gender pay and potentially going forward in ethnic pay, right? I think it puts a greater degree of sustained pressure on companies to address underlying issues than the pressure around getting the composition of the board to be seen to be correct in the eyes of the people who take an interest in these things.
Peter, you've worked. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
No, go on.
I was going to say, Lee mentioned earlier this sort of importance of educational institutions as well as businesses working attentively in this area of social mobility. You've worked both, you know, in government as a senior civil servant, you know, and for boards in business. What's your sort of take on how we might be able to do this more collaboratively across boundaries rather than this is just something for an education institution or a business or government? How can we get that sort of joined up approach?
Well, the government has taken a number of steps. I mean, it set up the Social Mobility Commission, which I think has produced a very good toolkit, which is about on the web, which, you know, sets out for organisations how you can get started on what, you know, what Lee talked about earlier, measuring socioeconomic diversity in the workforce and amongst potential recruits. And clearly, I think, has a role about giving attention to the issue. Now, the deal, of course, is that government itself is in a sort of slightly difficult position, because if you look at the socioeconomic diversity of the cabinet, it's not great. In fact, it's in the political, socioeconomic diversity in the political class is probably almost as bad as it is in sort of professions like barristers and the military. I mean, if you look at the data, actually, in some senses, if you look at the captains of industry, there is better socioeconomic diversity. I mean, it's not good enough, but it is better than in the political class, the upper echelons of barristers and the military. But clearly that there is going to be an issue here, as there has been in other aspects of diversity, which is the extent to which government acts just as an encourager and an exhorter, or do you go further and introduce things like, regulate, as it's done around gender pay reporting and stuff like that. I personally think it will that it will in due course, because social mobility on all the data available, which wasn't great before the pandemic, has got worse as a result of the pandemic. And that is likely to be quite enduring because of the hit the education sector has taken as a result of the pandemic. And the early data around, what is happening in schools in underprivileged areas and stuff like that, about how kids in those schools, are even further behind where kids in much higher performing schools are, is appalling. So I think the pressure on the government from society at large, coupled with things like the levelling up agenda, will increase the pressure on the government to take a more catalytic role in the social mobility agenda.
Thank you, Peter.
And it isn't something which government can address on its own. It has to require steps both within government and in organisations outside government.
Emma, what's your take on this? Would you agree with Peter that this has become inflamed from the pandemic, and what kinds of things would you like to see from your side?
No, definitely. So Alan and Overy are business members to a charity called the Fair Education Alliance, which looks at reducing education equality in the UK. So there's around 280 members made up of charities that are doing some fantastic work in the social mobility space. Universities, think tanks, businesses like Credit Suisse, Bloomberg, KPMG, they all want to collaboratively have more of a collective voice when it comes to addressing a lot of the issues that are faced in schools up and down the country, and what we can do, not just what those charities can do, but then what we can do collectively. So we see that as a real important step in terms of what we can do as an employer to support those organisations. So how can we bring them together, and through our funding that goes to actually set up the charity to have those people driving all of that work forward. I think that's a small part that we can play. Equally, I think there's lots that we can do. I use the charities that are on the board to facilitate some of the programs that I want to do to kind of help shape our understanding and thinking of what we would like to do as an organisation. So it doesn't need to replicate what's already out there. So I'd recommend, if anyone wants to go and see where the good and the great are collaborating, I'd check out the Fair Education Alliance, would be my advice.
Brilliant. Thanks, Emma. I'm going to go to the questions shortly. Lee, anything else you want to add on this point before we go to the questions?
No, and there's some really good questions coming through. I can see. I feel like I'm in an academic seminar here as much as a business seminar. What I would say is I would echo the points made. I think this is coming. When I do work with big organisations and speak with boards, my view is act now, because it's going to come your way. So be proactive about this, and I think that it will come from government, and we'll see, and it may be mirroring some of the activities we've seen in other aspects of diversity. But I also think as a business case, whether it's about your customer base and how you reflect that more clearly, or it's about your own staff force and enabling them to be productive and fulfilling their full potential. I think this agenda is coming your way, and so any organisation that isn't thinking about it, I think, is in danger in the future, from a very, very much a business case, I would argue.
Thanks, Lee. I'm going to try my best to address the questions to one panel member so we can get through as many as possible. If any of you have a longer question and would like to ask it verbally, then please just raise your hand and we'll try and mix them up with ones that we've already got written down. So Emma, I'm going to ask this one from one anonymous attendee. We're struggling internally with debates about what is the appropriate way to ask social mobility data. Is there a single answer to that? What questions should we be asking? We're quite a small organisation, so concerned that making it too granular makes it difficult to guarantee anonymity. We're facing real pushback from the legal team. Any sort of practical thoughts on that one?
I can understand their pain about the legal pushback. So just following on from what Peter said, the Social Mobility Commission, they have a really good website called Social Mobility Works, and they have an actual employer toolkit, which is all around collecting data. So it picks up on all of the things that Lee has mentioned in terms of which questions to answer, but then there is also how you ask staff. So yes, we did have to go through a number of data privacy policies, because obviously that's personal and sensitive data. You have to be very transparent to your employees as to what you'll do with that data once it's been collected. And then I think it's really key to kind of then loop back to your employees and actually say what you've done with the data and what difference that's made, or what different things you're going to do as a result of having collected that data. So my top tip would be to engage with if you have an in-house legal team like we do, to make sure you have a data privacy policy, which you may already have for other areas of D&I that you collect as an employer, but make sure you have that in place and make sure you're as transparent and as open with your employees as to why you're collecting that data. I think that's really key.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emma. Lee, I think this one potentially both you and Peter mentioned about talent, so you can fight over this one. How exactly can we be clear about defining talent when recruiting? Is it possible to have a recruitment process where experience and qualifications can be judged fairly? Do you want to take that one, Lee?
Well, happy to come in with an initial thoughts on that. I mean, over the years have become more skeptical of our ability to select talent. So I think we use a lot of different metrics. I have become a fan of the sort of threshold approach, where you look at a certain sort of threshold of skills or qualifications or experience, and then you might use other criteria, including social background, as they do in the US in some instances, rather than the sort of trying to go down the route of just getting more and more data and doing more and more tests and things to sort of find the very, very best. I'm not sure if that actually is justified in terms. I think it actually had a lot of cost as well around it. I think also, you know, using interviews, for example, I've been on both sides of the table on interviews over the years. Then they're not a great way of actually selecting in many ways, because what they're doing is judging you on your presentational skills in a very you know, formal setting, and I think that just tends to benefit those from more middle class backgrounds. So, you know, sometimes you can't avoid doing some interviews, but I think you've got to try and think about how you do that carefully. And perhaps you don't share your views on the candidates until after the interview's done. You know, there's lots of studies that suggest that's probably a better way of doing it. So I think there's lots of biases in the way that we attract talent at the moment that we could certainly improve.
Yeah, there's a great article. If you want to see a critique of talent, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a great article in the New Yorker called "The Talent Myth," sort of critiquing, you know, the whole notion of talent and using Enron. I know it's quite dated as an example of you can fixate on talent and it can have very toxic implications as well. So it might be worth a read. Okay, we had a question from Caroline Pickard. Any practical tips for an international working environment? I think that was in the context of sort of class and sort of judging or evaluating class in that kind of context. Peter, do you want to have a go at that one?
Well, I think you can apply some of the principles, but not the specifics necessarily of the questions that, say, the Social Mobility Commission has suggested for looking at socioeconomic diversity. But I think clearly starting with a principle that we want to have a socioeconomically diverse workforce can be translated into practice in environments outside the UK. It's clearly potentially easier to do in some countries than it is in others. I mean, I think it's relatively easy in the US, right? I mean, and in the US is an environment where there is better social mobility than there is in the UK. Probably really difficult to do in mainland China.
So just on this, Will, just to add to what Peter's saying, I mean, this is something that I get asked about increasingly at the moment, certainly in terms of senior boards, which tend to be quite international in their makeup. And I think this is one of the new sort of boundaries, if you like, of research in this area. How do we consistently measure socioeconomic background of people from different countries? There are many studies that look at socioeconomic background in other countries. It's just how do we do that consistently across the world? And I've not seen many academic papers on that, to be honest, at the moment, but I think it's certainly something that we're going to have to get a handle on. I think I agree with Peter. I think you can probably use the same principles that we use for the UK, but we're probably going to have to find some way of doing it so it's fair. You've got to have it being fair to all those involved. But I think we're early days on that at the moment.
Right, thanks, Lee. Emma, I've got a question here. Many diversity, equality, and inclusion teams say they focus on intersectional socio-mobility and not socio-mobility as such. How do we change that outlook?
I think it's probably going to change itself. So I think some of the reports that we're doing internally, you are naturally going to have that intersectionality with other areas of diversity. So a couple of years ago, we took part in a report with the Bridge Group and about 8 other law firms, which was looking at progression within a law firm over 5 years. So solicitors that were 5 years post-qualification, how had they done 5 years after being in the organisation? So where were they? Had they left? Had they progressed to partner? You couldn't help but look at the different intersectionalities. So it was a very clear understanding that it was going to take a Black female from a low socioeconomic background 18 months longer to progress to partner. That's if they stayed in the organisation, than their white male counterpart from a more privileged background. So that's aggregated data. That's not specific to us, but that was over 8 different law firms. So the more and more different reports that you do and the analysis that you do as an organisation, you are going to pick up on those other areas of diversity. And I think that's really important to do that. So if you're making the effort and the conscious effort to go and do some of those data collection, those focus groups, ensure that you're looking at all areas and cover that in those conversations, because it will rise to the surface and you will get that back. So if you do an independent analysis like we did, that's some of the reporting that'll come back in the key summary findings. And so they'll do a lot of the work for you, but obviously it should be something foremost at the forefront of what you're doing as well.
Thanks, Emma. Lee, there's a question from Mike Beckett here. Do we need targets? Do we need harder action like quotas with lead in time to make it work? What's the role of benchmarking table rankings?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just before I come on to that, Will, just to add to what Emma was saying, I mean, I feel quite strongly about this because a lot of people I talk to, a lot of studies suggest that those people who might be female or might be Black or Asian actually suffer, in my view, from almost classism, that if they happen to come from a working class background, and it's kind of this almost taboo subject. And many colleagues who feel that they have been prejudiced against because of their working class background, and yet might be being helped as part of another aspect of diversity. And the irony is, they would argue that the biggest obstacle is actually their socioeconomic background. So I think that's just something we really need to tackle. And this is not a competition. All these things are related to each other, of course. But the studies suggest that socioeconomic background is a huge obstacle, both here, certainly in the UK, and indeed in the US. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there because I really feel that's a huge issue at the moment. So in terms of, sorry, what was the question? I've forgotten the question you asked me now. Oh yes, it was targets. Being in the education system, I have been skeptical of some of the warping sort of behavior that is encouraged by targets. So in a school or university context, often, and you'll know this, Will, being a professor as well, it's sometimes wrongly sort of couched. Targets can basically encourage games playing, cheating even. So you have to be really careful with targets. But I feel at the moment that we do need something like that, well constructed, well framed, to move the dial in this debate. So it'd be really interesting to see what happens with KPMG on their targets. I think they were broadly conceived. They were about, I think it was, Emma might know better, I think it was a third of middle managers coming from low socioeconomic backgrounds broadly. This is the aim over a certain time period. So, personally, I think we should sort of consider carefully how we do them. But yes, I would have targets. I'm not sure about quotas, though. I'm not sure about quotas, because I think one of the problems you get into there is what you don't want to do is promote people into positions that aren't able to do the job. That I think then actually creates a negative in this whole debate. So I do think you need people that are good enough. So that would what I'd say. But you can do that through targets, in my view.
And rankings, Emma, you I think have been involved or know a fair bit about the Social Mobility Employer Index, which is sort of one of these kinds of rankings. Are they helpful? Does that sort of nudge organisations to up their game? I had a quick look at that ranking from last year, and I noticed there are very specific types of organisations at the moment in that ranking, particularly professional and financial service firms and some government departments. What's your kind of take on rankings in this space?
So this is actually going to be one of my little key takeaways, that if you aren't already, have a look. So the Social Mobility Foundation has the Social Mobility Employer Index, which they launched about 5 years ago. It's free to enter, and it does allow any business to kind of assess and monitor what they're doing. And you don't have to do the full sort of 7 areas if you wanted to just focus on one particular area where you've got more data. I'd recommend anyone. So the index opened about last week, and it's open until the 27th of May. When we first entered it, it was very difficult because it's going around and collecting lots of data. You need some resource behind it if you're really going to put forward a great entry, or to make sure that you put your best foot forward. What I love about it is that you get a bespoke feedback report at the end, which draws attention to some of the things that you might have not considered, that you might want to think differently about. So some of the practices that you're doing is actually that distracting or detracting away from your efforts in one particular area. So things like targets, apparently 40% of employers that enter that employer index have targets. You're not going to obviously see what those targets are. And I think, as obviously Lee mentioned, it's only PwC and KPMG that are actively talking about targets in this space. You can also remain anonymous. So if you want to enter and you don't want to worry about where you come into the ranking, you can select that you don't appear there. So you will see some law firms, some other businesses that choose not to. So yes, there's reasons to celebrate, and yes, there are great case studies and examples and best practices that you can kind of see what other employers are doing that can help change some of the narratives, or you can present new ideas internally. It's been lucky, we've been consecutively improved for the last 3 years, and it gets very hard, the pressure of getting even better this year. We've just had the report through. It sends shivers down my spine. I don't want to fall backwards, but equally, I don't know if that's particularly helpful, though. I think what the actual toolkit is really helpful, but it's best not to try to concentrate so much on the rankings, because you're always going to see the bigger players further up the chain. And that's great because they've got the resource, they've got the capacity to do that work. So I think maybe in time, removing the ranking would be good, just because the service of what the foundation and the index and the reporting that you get, I think there's more benefit in doing it than worrying too much about where you score.
Great advice. Thank you, Emma. We're closing in on the last 10 minutes. Another anonymous attendee question here, probably for you here, Lee. In the same way that we should avoid writing gender job descriptions, is there a way of avoiding writing them in a very middle class language?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there are ways of trying to just make sure that any middle class assumptions that we make, that we sort of try and banish, if you like. I mean, there's been lots of studies done in terms of work experience, and obviously there's the whole issue of internships, not assuming that people can pay their way in those very early career days. And just, when seeking work experience, thinking about the different context that has for people from different backgrounds. So I think that's absolutely right, that we could probably do more there. The other thing that I'm conscious with this discussion, and we're just skating over sort of in some ways, is that, the rankings, it's what's really interesting to me is there's certain industry sectors that seem to feature a lot in those rankings at the moment. And what's really apparent is the creative industries, for example, are less present in those. And so there's a variation in at the moment in terms of progress on social mobility. And it tends to be those industries, I don't want to make any sweeping statements here, but those that are less formal, where talent is less perhaps defined clearly, that I think are some of the slowest movers in this debate. And these are many leading, global players, based in Britain, but global players in the world. And it's just really noticeable, I think, to me, that certain industries seem to be pushing on this agenda, where other industry sectors are falling behind. So I do wonder whether somehow we need to get a bit more dialogue across industry sector. But I think you get into some of the nuances, perhaps, of different sectors. And I think the creative industries interest me a lot, because I think they're very prominent, but they use perhaps less clearly defined ways to measure talent. Which is probably one of the reasons why they're a bit behind the curve.
Thanks, Lee. There's a comment here from Karina Pavlisa, which probably don't have time to answer, but I think worth exploring. Would cultural class analysis be a useful lens to look at parental occupational class, as this involves particular resources, capitals of parents that are passed on to children? I think that's a really interesting one. I'm not sure if you've got a quick remark on that one, Lee.
I just say, yeah, absolutely. And it has been used in some studies. I think it can be really insightful to look at the idea of, cultural, social, economic capital. The only thing we find in the studies, it's very hard to document for lots of people consistently. And that's one of the tensions with that. But I do think it can be really powerful in terms of research and talking to your employees about their resources they bring to the workplace. But I don't think it could replace socioeconomic background data in terms of that monitoring, if you like. I think it would complement that, in my view.
There's a really interesting question from Margaret Casey Hayford. Lee's point about the confusion between ethnicity and class is of critical importance. This country is deeply classist, and it is this that holds back so many people, whether they are white or people of colour. There is no point in being self-congratulatory if they have welcomed in Black people from public school and Oxbridge backgrounds with professional parents. But people are shy about saying what their background is, so it will be hard to collect the data. How do you foster an openness without all the fear of prejudice that might attract? It's a great question. A lot going on there. Emma, I'm not sure if you've got any thoughts there from an organisational perspective.
So the way that we're launching our internal network is that it's open to everyone. So we don't have any way of measuring what somebody identifies as being their class. It goes back to Lee's point about, well, define your own class. So everyone is really welcome, but it is very different. And my area of work doesn't sort of overlap in terms of what the DE and I do in terms of that granular assessing of backgrounds of individuals that might come from very well backgrounds themselves, but might be Black, Caribbean or other ethnicity. So probably not going to be able to answer as well on that question.
Okay, I'm going to select one more question. I know Karina was the next one, but we've asked one from her already. So one from Jackie Barrett. Does the panel agree that the best way to improve social mobility within an organisation is to start with measurement, so it has a baseline from which to work? Peter, do you want to answer that one?
Yes.
Love that. Very succinct. Lee, I'm presuming as a data guy, you would agree.
I do, but I also think it goes back to what Peter was saying right at the beginning of this discussion. I do wonder whether we do need some sort of external organisation. I know we've got the Social Mobility Commission and the advice it's given, but perhaps something looking at pay gaps. And I know there's been, I think, quite successful initiatives in other areas of diversity. Maybe we could get Sir Peter Gershon to chair this, and I could help him. Maybe Emma could sit on that as well. But I do think that in some way, measuring something annually would incentivise organisations to do that. I mean, we haven't had time to get into this. Of course, socioeconomic background isn't in the 2001 Equalities Act, and a lot of people always mention that there's not a legal requirement. But I do wonder whether we could create some initiative to hold companies to account in an intelligent way, hopefully.
Before I hand to Chris, Emma, Peter, and Lee, one tip for everyone to take away. You know how it is when you attend these sort of these webinars, you want some take homes. What would be the kind of one thing? Peter, you were so succinct with your one-word answer last time. Why don't I start with you as a one take home for the audience, and let's go Emma and then Lee.
Well, it would be to adopt the Social Mobility Commission toolkit and start asking the questions it sets out in it, in order to be of understanding what the current socioeconomic diversity is of the workforce. Because in my experience, if you start measuring something and you don't like the answer that comes out, most people will start to do something about it.
That's great. Thank you. Emma?
Also, like Peter, it would be around the data, but if I had to choose something different, I would start talking internally to people in your organization about what they're doing. So don't work in silos. If you're in a particular area of the business and you're very passionate and you care about this, start finding out what is happening in your organization. And if, like me, there isn't anything, set up your own working group and make it happen. I'm really pleased that I did, and hopefully others can do the same.
Thank you. Lee, less than a minute, please.
So just to add to what the others have said, I think it has to come from the top as well. I think you need to treat this seriously as a board, which sends a signal to the rest of the organisation. Too often, this is seen as an agenda that is for the back office or for certain aspects of the organisation. It has to be from the very top and it influence the very culture of your business. Sorry to end on a big note there, but yeah.
That's great. Before I pass back to Chris, who's just going to thank the panel, I would also just like to say a big thank you to the IoD, and particularly Chris, Heidi, and Georgia. Lots of stuff, as you know, goes on behind the scenes to make this happen. So a big thank you to them, and also just to sort of flag that the next IoD Centre for Corporate Governance webinar is on Wednesday, the 27th of April. And it's going to be on private equity. So you can find that on the IoD website and via Eventbrite. Chris, I'll hand back to you to close off.
Thanks very much, Will, and thanks to the panel. And just very briefly from a IoD perspective, to really reinforce Lee's last point, this does need board involvement. If this is seen as a sort of slightly technical or as academic exercise going on down in the bowels of the organisation, it won't have the impact it needs. There needs to be leadership and oversight from the boards. Thank you very much to all of you for your fantastic contributions. There's been an awful lot of good practical insight and advice. I'm sure many of us will be going off immediately to look at the toolkit that you've mentioned. So that's really been great. Thank you to everybody who's joined us today. Just to let you know that there is a recording of the webinar if you want to revisit it or share it with contacts who weren't able to join us today. We'll aim to get that out in the next couple of days, so keep an eye on the IoD Centre's social media accounts over the next few days, and we'll provide a link to that recording as soon as we can. Better finish now, because I know a number of the panel have to head off to other appointments spot on the 4. Thank you very much, everyone, again for participating. Thank you all to Will particularly, but all the panel, and to Georgie for running the session. We'll end there. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.